case you didn't already know, Donald Trump will be the next president of the United States. Trump, the well-known deal maker, has sworn to bring peace to the Middle East. But what will that look like, and how likely is it at all? I'm Natasha Feroze, the Spectator's deputy broadcast editor, and to discuss this, I'm joined by Paul Wood, one of our writers who covered it in the magazine this week. Paul, thank you so much for joining me on Spectator TV. Could you explain for us why, as an Israeli, as Jewish American, you'd be happy for Trump to be the next president, and why you might be quite cautious about it?
Well, Trump was extraordinarily pro-Israel in his first time around in the White House. He moved the American embassy to Jerusalem, something that many of his predecessors had resisted because Jerusalem is disputed ground. The Palestinians claim it as their future capital, as does Israel. He did that, thereby recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital. He also ended Iran's nuclear deal, allowed Israel to annex the Golan Heights, and in generally lent a very sympathetic ear to Israel's expansionist goals. And the reason for that may be simple, that a lot of Christian evangelicals who align themselves with Israeli settlement goals supported Mr. Trump in the election. And of course, Jared Kushner, who is Jewish, and thereby Mr. Trump's favorite daughter, Ivanka, now also Jewish, they were heavily involved in this process. So Trump said, quote, "Nobody has protected Israel more than me," and for once it may not be hyperbole. So for a lot of Jews, that's a very important issue. On the other hand, many Jews are traditionally Democrats, are also traditionally liberal. Mr. Trump was just about the most hostile candidate you can imagine to that mindset. So I imagine there was a lot of angst over people casting their votes this time. And I wrote about a very canny advert that Mr. Trump ran, essentially acknowledging that people would have to hold their noses to vote for him. I think that was true not just of Jewish voters, but of many other voters. But many Jewish voters decided he was the guy to protect Israel and indeed to stand up to anti-Semitism at home, just as a lot of other voters thought, well, we don't like him, but he may look after our interests. I think that was the calculation that won him the election.
And of course, the relationship with Benjamin Netanyahu is really important in this. And they haven't always had a straightforward relationship, as you say in your piece, have they?
Well, Mr. Netanyahu has spent a career standing up to American presidents. And there's a famous story about the first meeting with Bill Clinton. And Mr. Clinton came out saying, who the F does he think he is? Who's the effing superpower here? And Netanyahu, over the past couple of years in dealing with Joe Biden, has almost made it a virtue standing up to America, which, don't forget, is the ultimate guarantor of Israel's security. But Mr. Netanyahu, looking to his own constituency, says, I'm the guy who can stand up to the United States. Now, there's a more particular reason for any bad blood between him and Trump, which is that he recognized Joe Biden's win in 2020, as he was obliged to do. What else was he going to do? But Mr. Trump, who still maintains the 2020 election was stolen from him, didn't like that. And by the accounts that I've seen, they didn't speak for years, maybe as long as 4 years. And Mr. Trump gave an interview to Time magazine in April in which he said, one, Netanyahu's really to blame for the October 7th attacks. It happened on his watch. And two, he's really quite unreliable. And there was a kind of feeling of personal animus there because as president, Donald Trump had ordered the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, the commander of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. And according to Trump's account, it was supposed to be a joint US-Israeli operation, and Netanyahu backed out of that at the last moment. So not a stand-up guy, which, as I wrote, being disloyal, the absolute worst thing you can be in Trump world. But they patched it up over the summer, and Donald Trump said various contradictory things. There's a shock about Israel and the war with Hamas. But at some point, he did say they need to do what they need to do, and he supported that.
One of the key things that Netanyahu has always said is there will not be a two-state solution. So when it comes to Trump, who has always been a deal maker, when it comes to the negotiating table, surely Trump and Saudi Arabia are going to butt heads with Netanyahu in terms of any feasibility of seeing Palestine as a state.
Well, the danger for Netanyahu is that Trump wants to do the deal of the century in the Middle East, bring peace to the Middle East, which would mean a Saudi-Israeli rapprochement. And the price for that, MBS, the crown prince who rules Saudi Arabia, has said, would be a Palestinian state. They weren't public about they backed a Palestinian state. That's been long-standing Saudi policy, but they didn't make it a condition of joining the Abraham Accords until recently in September, and that's all to do with the fury on the Arab street over the huge civilian death toll in Gaza and now in Lebanon. And that's dangerous for Netanyahu. Doesn't mean it's going to happen. A Palestinian state is a huge obstacle. For one thing, who would be in charge of it? Hamas is now incredibly popular in the West Bank as a result of what's happened in Gaza. Secondly, there are now 500,000 or so Israeli settlers who live on the other side, on the West Bank, on the other side of the 1967 line, territory that Israel captured in 1967. Their presence there make it very, very difficult to see the practical side of establishing a Palestinian state. It would almost mean civil war in Israel to remove them. It was very painful for the Israelis removing a few tens of thousands of settlers from Gaza. We're now talking about hundreds of thousands of people. So given all that, it's very difficult. Nevertheless, you can imagine Trump wanting to do this immense deal, and for two reasons. One, he's transactional. And according to one estimate I've seen, it cost $23 billion over the past year for the US to support Israel's war effort. That's a lot of money. Secondly, he's an isolationist. He doesn't like foreign wars. And Israel is expanding the number of fronts it's fighting on. And now with Iran, that's where they might have to call on US help. So Trump said that it's the worst mistake America ever made getting involved in the Middle East. And having to go back there every 5 or 10 years, he thinks is costing the country too much in blood and treasure. So if he could do this mega deal, because a deal maker is fundamentally what Trump is, he would want to do it, even at the cost of what Netanyahu says would damage Israel's interests, which is the establishment of a Palestinian state. Of course, a lot of people think it'd be very good for Israel to be in two states and allow the Palestinians to rule their own lives and not be in perpetual occupation, but not for Netanyahu. He spent his whole life fighting against it.
And of course, Trump picking J.D. Vance as his vice president, also an isolationist, also very much in the America First pool, right?
Yeah, not just Vance. It's really a question of how many loyalists Trump manages to bring into the bureaucracy. In 2016, he wasn't expecting to win. He was stunned when he won. He was surprised. He hadn't prepared for it. The transition was a mess. And then he had to draw on a lot of Republican establishment figures who really had the opposite instincts to him. This time around, he may be better prepared. And he'll have to be prepared because he's going to have to face down the instincts of the entire American foreign policy establishment if he is going to detach from the Middle East. But he's got a vice president in Vance who ostensibly shares those views, although Mr. Vance may be something of a chameleon, saying what is required at any particular moment. But yes, Vance is on board. And if you can staff the bureaucracy at all levels, then maybe we might see this. But there are two things, fighting with each other here. The last president, Trump, backed Israeli settlements, backed Netanyahu. The Israeli right is celebrating. He'd have to depart from Trump 1 to become Trump 2, the deal maker. I mean, anything's possible with Trump, isn't it? He's mercurial, unpredictable, and he could go either way here.
How significant, Paul, do you think it is that Jared Kushner has said he's not going to be involved in Trump's future cabinet? He wasn't involved in the election, although allegedly was doing some things behind the scenes. And he has a very good relationship with MBS from Saudi Arabia.
Well, Kushner was the boy wonder in the first Trump administration. Everybody laughed a bit, seeing him go off in his Armani sunglasses and his nicely tailored blue jacket, under which he wore a flak jacket, to the Middle East and go around trying to make peace, and everybody chortled and thought it wouldn't happen. And then he comes forward with the Abraham Accords, which are about economics. It's not an overarching peace deal, but nevertheless, it's the UAE and Bahrain and also Morocco and Sudan recognizing Israel. I read, didn't get confirmation, but nobody denied it, that he was tutored by Henry Kissinger. And perhaps you can see Mr. Kissinger's rather more experienced hand at work here. But the Abraham Accords were a diplomatic triumph for the Trump administration, no two ways about it. So now, as you were saying, Kushner said he won't go back into the White House. Apparently his investment fund is doing extremely well. There's a shocker. One of the early commitments he got was $2 billion from MBS, the Saudi crown prince, who apparently went against the advice of his own investment team, his own investment advisors to do it, looked very much like some as payback for instance, the Trump administration killing the Iran deal. Anyway, whatever it was, those $2 billion, according to congressional investigators, have paid off so far with $87 million in management fees. So very difficult to carry on accepting that kind of money and new money, or at least you have to put the management fund at arm's length if Kushner came back. But as he was saying, he was quite important behind the scenes in the Trump campaign at various crucial points. You can imagine, again, Trump asking him to act as a back channel to MBS. They have a very good personal rapport, Kushner and MBS, and working some kind of magic to get the Saudis on board with the peace deal. So and this is the way Trump works. He doesn't like official channels. He likes informal face-to-face agreements, and he likes dealing with family. So yes, Kushner could come back in that respect.
And of course, Trump wouldn't take kindly to any sort of humiliation against him. And so far, Netanyahu's track record is that he's ignored a lot of calls from the Harris-Biden team to de-escalate, calls for a ceasefire. How difficult could Trump make Netanyahu's life should Netanyahu to completely ignore him?
We've had a quite astonishing spectacle over the past year or so of an American President, Joe Biden, publicly setting red lines and Netanyahu and the Israeli government just breezing past them. It's the opposite of talk softly and carry a big stick. So talk loudly and people don't listen to you. The US supplies some 2/3 of Israel's weaponry. It's the ultimate guarantor of Israel's security. You could imagine an American president, as Ronald Reagan did, picking up the phone to an Israeli leader and saying, this was 82, the siege of Beirut, just stop. And that Israeli leader thinking, well, we've got no choice but to just stop. So this comes down to whether Trump's this brilliant negotiator. Is he going to essentially bluff Netanyahu that American arms would be cut off? Because that's what it comes down to. If they were cut off, if they were restricted, would that send Israel into a fight for its life? You know, these are the highest stakes, but you can imagine Trump being more effective than Biden, because I don't think anybody could be less effective than President Biden's been over the past year in dealing with Israel.
Netanyahu himself is facing major challenges in his cabinet. So could you see a scenario in which Netanyahu might not be the leader of Israel any longer? And would relations with someone else in the Israeli war cabinet fare better with Trump?
Well, Netanyahu is consolidating power. He's kicked out a defense minister, Yoav Gallant, who actually knew how to fight a war, and brought in somebody who doesn't have that kind of operational experience. And the test seems to be personal loyalty with Netanyahu. A lot of Israelis don't like that. One of the wedge issues between him and Gallant was whether to accept a hostage deal or not. A lot of Israelis want that hostage deal to be done whatever the cost. Now, Netanyahu's supporters will say he's being statesmanlike in not taking the easy path, that is freeing the hostages, in order to make sure that in the long term Israel is safe. That's what his supporters would say. But yes, no doubt he's consolidating power. He was an extremely divisive figure before the October 7th attacks, huge demonstrations in the streets against his judicial reforms. He is still that divisive figure. But I think for the time being, the majority of Israelis think we're fighting a war, not just in Gaza, but in Lebanon and soon perhaps against Iran too. And that helps him consolidate his position. His most bitter critics say that he's carrying on the fight in order to stay out of jail. And this is one thing he does share with Mr. Trump. Mr. Trump's a convicted felon, the first American president to be a convicted felon. Netanyahu is facing serious corruption charges. The evidence, according to some, looks pretty strong against him. 3 separate corruption trials, in fact. He could go to jail if he's out of office, and presumably that is uppermost in his mind.
Paul Wood, thank you for joining us on Spectator TV.